Welcome to What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean, a popular resistance broadcast of hot news out of the region. In partnership with Black Alliance for Peace Haiti Americas team, Code Pink, Common Frontiers, Council on Hemispheric Affairs, Friends of Latin America, Interreligious Task Force on Central America, Massachusetts Peace Action, and Task Force on the Americas, we broadcast Thursdays at 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 7:30 p.m. Eastern, right here on YouTube Live, including channels for The Convo Couch, Popular Resistance, and Code Pink. Post-broadcast recordings can be found at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Telegram, radindiemedia.com, and now under podcasts at popularresistance.org. Today's episode, Colombia, Total Peace and the Fight to Free All Political Prisoners. I'm happy to have two fantastic guests join us today, everyone, and I'm sure you're going to really get a lot out of this conversation. Anthony Dest is joining us from New York. He is with the Colombian Freedom Collective, and it is specifically his prisoner project that we're going to be talking about in this episode. And then joining us from Cali, Colombia, is Ajamu Baraka of Black Alliance for Peace, Haiti Actions team, and he is also the Black Alliance for Peace national organizer. And he can talk to us about what full peace looks like in Colombia and what the hope is for the region. I should also just remind all of you that, and some of you have been following the program for several years, that I was in Colombia in May of 2021 during the Paro Nacional on a human rights observation delegation. So this is a really, really special episode for me on a very personal level to have this conversation with Anthony and Ajamu. It's terrific follow-up as to what's happened to some of the people since May of 2021. And so let me just start with a brief background. Some of you will be familiar with this and others of you are new to this subject. So let me give a background starting in April of 2021. So in April 2021, tens of thousands of people took to the streets in Colombia to demand change. They rejected decades of state violence and deepening inequality. Over the course of 3 months, the largest protest in Colombian history spread to over 800 municipalities throughout the country. The months-long protests played a huge role in creating the conditions for the election of Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez. Changes are afoot in Colombia, and the inauguration of President Gustavo Petro and Vice President Francia Marquez on August 7, 2022, marked an important shift away from decades of political repression. However, more than 300 people accused of participating in the 2021 protests still remain incarcerated and/or are facing harsh sentences on trumped-up charges. Political prisoners from the 2021 national strike are currently on a hunger strike in 4 prisons around the country. Despite numerous promises from the Petro administration to address their situation, the prisoners continue to face dire conditions. The only demand that would bring an end to the hunger strike, a response from the national government regarding the December 22 proposal emerging from political prisoners in Palmyra for the creation of a table for dialogue, Mesa de Diálogo. So let me introduce Anthony and Ajamu to all of you. And also Anthony asked that I share where to stream this. I'll put a couple links in the chat for you, Anthony. So welcome, gentlemen. Really wonderful to have you both with us for this episode. It's really, as I mentioned earlier, it's a really important follow-up to a number of our previous episodes regarding the Paro Nacional in Colombia, as well as the presidential primaries and the presidential election. So this is a terrific opportunity to continue informing our audience about Colombia. So Anthony, why don't we start with you and what your project is and what the prisoners are demanding and why they are still imprisoned when the Colombian president is very vocal in the media, social media particularly, about countries throughout the region releasing all political prisoners.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting us on today. And it's great to raise these issues right now because I think it's more important than ever. And just to kind of begin, as you mentioned in the intro there, the Colombian national strike in 2021 started on April 28th, and it lasted for about 3 months. But it's, for me, pretty hard to put an end date on it because the expressions of a struggle for dignity and resisting state violence and resisting capitalism continued long after whatever people tend to think of the strike ending as ending, right? That it didn't culminate at a specific date. So that resistance has continued, and there's all kinds of vibrant expressions of where this has gone in the last couple of years. And I think it's really important to highlight that. But another way that this strike hasn't ended is that there are still a lot of people doing time for expressing themselves, for struggling for dignity during that national strike. And so the most recent numbers we have are upwards of 300 political prisoners from recent demonstrations for participating in social mobilizations currently in Colombia. And this project is not my project. It's a collective project. We're the Colombia Freedom Collective, and it's a few different organizations here in the United States, including the Black Alliance for Peace, the U.S. Peace Council, Woodbine, and the National Lawyers Guild San Francisco chapter, as well as organizations in Colombia like the Comisión Intereclesial de Justicia y Paz and Trabajo y Dignidad, as well as the Punto de Resistencia en Paso del Aguante, which is the primary case that we are working with. And basically, I've been working on Colombia for many years now. I'm also Colombian, and I was inspired by what was happening during the national strike in 2021. And, during the strike, I made it down to Colombia, established contact with several folks that had been involved more towards the tail end of it after some of the most brutal state repression had ended. I think it's really important to highlight that over 40 people were killed by police, and at least 80 people were killed during the protests. Dozens of folks were forcibly disappeared. Many more were injured. There's at least, I think, 25 cases of sexual violence committed by police forces against participants in the national strike. So, that violence is really what kept people out in the street, and that's what people were resisting throughout the national strike. And now to see that the folks that really put their lives on the line to better their conditions have been facing time, and really hard time, for choosing to struggle. And like you said earlier, create the conditions for the election of the first progressive government in Colombian history, for me, was completely unacceptable. And, I think that is what inspires a lot of us that are part of this movement to demand the freedom of political prisoners in Colombia right now. So that's.
Let me, regarding the violence, for the audience, violence was like military style assault on people who were peacefully assembling. And it hadn't, these were, what we came to know as the ESMAD teams. And this were full-blown military style tactics and equipment that were used against civilians. It was more than violent. It was warfare, I would argue. And just to paint a picture for the audience. And when people assembled, it had nothing to do with whether it was peaceful, whether it was art, whether it was for music, just flying pancartas, banners, against the Duque government. These ESMAD teams would break up an event once it lasted what they deemed to be too long or got too large, whether it was peaceful or not. And it was done very, very, very violently with military style tactics. And it was pretty gruesome. For the majority of the country, it was about 70+% of the country that was protesting the government at that time, which was enormous. The government had pretty much lost the people by then. which I would argue is why the repression was so strong. But let me ask you about these people who were arrested. And so they were arrested under the Duque government. They were arrested for protesting. Were they, am I thinking that some were released at Christmas? Was that a holiday short-term thing, or was it actually Christmas of 2022, I'm thinking?
Right. No, so as you mentioned, there have been a couple kind of false starts on addressing the issue of political prisoners from the uprising. From the moment Petro was elected, I think he had it very clear that the national strike played a huge role in getting him there. And he mentioned it during his victory speech in June, I think it was, of 2022. Shortly after he was elected, there was talk about passing an amnesty law. And there were a lot of expectations around that, given Petro's governing coalition having a majority in the Congress. But because of reactionary political pressure, the Pacto Histórico pulled that part of the amnesty law out. And so there wasn't an amnesty law that passed in October. And then in December, Petro said that he was going to use this legal figure known as the agents of peace, gestores de paz, agentes de paz, to release hundreds of political prisoners before Christmas Eve. To date, I think there have been only, 14 people that have been designated as agents of peace. And of those, only 4 have been released. But I think for a lot of the folks that I work with, there were a lot of expectations about what that could mean for them, because the political prisoners, that many of whom were very vocal in their support for the new administration, expected for that to go through, but it did not happen, right? And shortly after the Christmas holiday passed, and it was clear that folks were not getting released from prison, prisoners in Palmira, the prison in Palmira, which is outside of Cali, went on strike, and they made demands about establishing a route for dialogue. And I just want to be clear about how modest the goal for that initial hunger strike was, right? They were just asking to establish a path to creating a formal space for dialoguing directly with the government. And in December, there was talks directly with the government, and they suspended the hunger strike. But then again, now in February 20th, they went on hunger strike again, because there was no advances in making that space for dialogue happen. And ultimately, that hunger strike lasted 10 days. 2 people sewed their mouths shut to reject even water. And it was suspended last Friday because there were, again, meetings with the government. There has yet to be a formal space for dialogue established, yet the stipulations for lifting the strike or suspending the strike were because they had met with the government, and there was enough reason to discontinue a hunger strike, which I should mention is extremely onerous under the conditions of Colombian prisons, which are already overcrowded. But that hunger strike not only was to establish that path for a space of dialogue with the national government, but it was also to call out how bad the conditions were in these prisons, right? They're dealing with water that is not safe. Several of them want psychosocial support, and they're not getting it. And it's been quite a difficult situation. But I can't emphasize enough how modest the demands were. And even then, the government was not willing to meet with the political prisoners that put them in office on their terms, right? Just to put this in perspective, Gustavo Petro has met with former President Alvaro Uribe 3 times since he was elected, and he has yet to meet with the political prisoners.
The people who helped put him in office, who helped get rid of Uribe. There's a couple things I'd like to follow up on. To me, and we said this before, the irony of not addressing these political prisoners when there is a call from the president of Colombia himself, for other Latin American countries to release their political prisoners. It's hard to understand that, especially considering the fact that there is now a new vice ministry in Colombia that was specifically created, and I believe it falls under the Minister of the Interior, but I'm not 100% sure. But it's a new vice ministry of social dialogue and equality. He has a whole team of people prepared to talk and negotiate whenever and whoever is ready. And yet the prisoners are ready, and you say it's modest demands, and yet that dialogue hasn't happened. Are there legal issues? I mean, some of the crimes that have been put against the prisoners, is there a concern there with any of those? I mean, with any or all of them, that some of them should remain in prison, or is this just another form of political persecution?
I mean, I think it's really important to point out that there are some very severe charges against some of the prisoners, and there's always going to be a legal question about a full-out amnesty versus a partial one, or what constitutes that amnesty. But I think it's just, again, important to insist that the prisoners that were on hunger strike last month were not demanding amnesty. They were demanding a space for dialogue, a formal way of dialoguing directly with the government, right? And so,
which the government has.
And to your question, I mean, for me, what are the limits of that dialogue? What makes some sort of dialogue feasible while others are off the table? And it's a very difficult question to ask in Colombia right now too, because through the total peace policy of the government, they're currently embarking on negotiations with everything from left-wing guerrilla groups to right-wing paramilitary criminal groups, right?
Right.
And I think a lot of us that are supporting the struggle of political prisoners right now, it's an unresolved question, and we have not heard good answers from the state in regards to it.
Let me make a comment about that also.
Sure.
I think one of the ways in which we can perhaps explain the slowness on the part of the government to address this issue of prisoners, while we see that the government is attempting to address a number of different contradictions in Colombian society by engaging in discussion with various forces, might be because these issues that they seem to have prioritized more so than this issue of these young prisoners, might be related to the kind of social pressure that they feel to address certain kinds of questions. The very fact that it appears that many people in Colombia sort of forgotten about these young people, it releases some of the pressure for them to really address this issue. The fact that that they are engaged in advancing, using the full weight of the legal system against these young folks, while not feeling any kind of pressure to address the issue of impunity. That is, who was responsible for all of the people who died during the course of this rebellion? These questions had never been answered. Therefore, they feel that they don't have the social pressure, the political pressure on them to really effectively address this. That's one piece of it. The other piece is that, there are enormous political complexities in Colombia regarding the state. Anthony alluded to that a moment ago. that there are certain questions that the government raised that they were going to attempt to address. But it appears that as a consequence of a reassessment of the balance of forces in the Colombian state, that the Petro government backed away from. We have to remember this is still the Petro Marquez government. They have latitude to do certain things, but the overall character of the state and the forces that still control large chunks of it still resides with the radical right wing. That's not to attempt to apologize for some things that have not been done, but just to kind of pull in some elements and help us understand some of the complexities that people are facing here in this space.
Well, that's true. I mean, these are really good points you bring up, because this is true for any new administration in any country. Just because the presidency changes doesn't mean a lot of the leadership management of other institution changes. A lot of people are civilian employees, like the immigration services, for example, that have been there, employees who have been there through multiple presidencies. They don't necessarily change just because there's a new president has been elected. Mm-hmm. So you can see how this would be a lot of things that have been inherited and aren't going to change overnight. And that's not unique to Colombia.
No, and that's why it's important, Terry, that these kinds of discussions take place, that the kind of work that Anthony has helped to pull together and helping to bring attention to the situation, that we support this and we help to amplify this, because without the social and political pressure coming from inside and from external sources, it's going to be very difficult for us to finally resolve this issue with these young people in prison.
Are the majority of the 300 young? I guess I would say young, like under 25, under 20, like.
I don't have the ages. I mean, it's been extremely difficult to get good information about this because it has not been systematized. And I just wanted to correct myself. It is 17 people who were named agents of peace and 4 who were released through that out of the more than 200 that Petro promised. But yeah, no, it's been extremely difficult to get good information. But yes, the majority are young people. And that was another remarkable part about this uprising, right? And it was that young people came out into the streets, people who were not necessarily part of trade unions, formerly members of social movements or political parties, took politics into their own hands and struggled for dignity where they lived, right? They became protagonists in their lives in a way that for a lot of people really rocked the boat. And I think that also has to do with why a lot of folks within the government are a little nervous about getting too deep with this, right? What is on the table for dialogue under the Petro administration? And, for me, I think that he kind of spelled it out a little bit during his victory speech after he was elected, when he said that we are going to develop capitalism in Colombia, not because we worship it, but because first we must overcome pre-modernity in Colombia. And for me, I think, when you're dealing with the questions of an uprising and this kind of political activity that really rocks the status quo, people get a little bit nervous about it. But what is also clear to me is that the folks that were out there on the street were struggling for dignity. They had a very clear mind, at least at first. It was about reversing and protesting against a neoliberal tax reform. And then it became about resisting state violence and the enduring legacy of colonial capitalism on Colombians, right? And so for me, I guess what are the limits to this dialogue are yet to be demonstrated, right? And I think, as Ajamu was saying, it's really important to put that political pressure on the new administration to see, what is possible. Because, the folks that we're working with from Paso del Aguante spent 15 months at least in pretrial detention, despite maintaining their innocence, right, for the crimes that they're accused of. And they're looking at spending up to 50 years in prison if they're convicted, right? These are entire people's lives, entire families' lives, communities that are being affected by this. And why, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's really listening to you describe who they are and having been there during the Paro Nacional, it's heartbreaking on a certain level, because so it was the young people that took up the voice for the nation, or the majority of the nation. And I remember talking to people's parents, grandparents, and the older generation saying, we should have done this. We have left it up to the young people to make the change, and it should have been us. And a lot of guilt. And then of course that guilt turned into enormous support for the movement that these young people were built and ultimately changed the government. And so it's heartbreaking to hear that the nation isn't behind them now. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, just this week, several members of families that were affected by the violence, families of political prisoners, former political prisoners themselves, traveled to Bogota once again to try and establish a meeting with the government, but they were unable to. But this is I've met with family members of people who were forcibly disappeared, whose children were murdered during the protests, and it honestly, I mean, it kind of feels like traveling into, I don't know, like 1979 Argentina or something, right? Like we're talking about that scope of state violence, but it happens under the radar. And because it's become, I guess, so normalized in the eyes of a lot of the international community about Colombia, that Colombia is a violent place or whatever, we don't necessarily hear about it as much, but it does continue. So, I think that's another part of what we're trying to raise here is, like, we're here to support the political prisoners, but we're also here to talk about the violence that occurred and the enduring impunity that Ajamu mentioned. Just in late February, there's a popular tribunal in one of the neighborhoods in Cali called Siloé, and they found the state guilty of continuous genocide, right? Because just in that neighborhood, over 16 people were killed during the national strike, right? And nobody really knows their names besides the folks that work on this. But again, these are communities that are affected for it. And who is perpetrating that violence and to what ends is again, what status quo was being sought to be preserved through that violence.
Well, and again, it goes back to, not all the institutions and leadership change just because a country gets a new president. What do you do with the existing national police, the existing military? Do you fire everyone? And then if you let them all go, then what happens to them? Then they start working from the outside in versus the inside out. And it's extraordinarily complex. It's just, to me, listening to you, to me, the biggest thing is what I'm hearing is that these young people have pretty much just been forgotten. And that is,
well, they have to a certain extent, and that's why this issue is important, because with Petro's commitment to this concept of total peace, in which they are attempting to engage some of the paramilitary forces and guerrilla groups to bring about a new environment in Colombia where there, in fact, is peace and the possibility of people to live with security. And the implication of national reconciliation. But the question is, when it comes to this situation where you have continued impunity coming out of the rebellion, where you have these people, young people, I refer to them as young people because, as Anthony said, most of the folks who was going to the streets and were engaged directly with the authorities were youthful, if you will. So with these young people still in prison, how do you have total peace? How do you have national reconciliation when this situation continues to fester like this? So that's why this has to be resolved. It has.
Looks like we lost him.
Yeah, you froze. You want to turn your video off? Ajamu? No. You want to turn your video off and do audio only and see if that works? Maybe he doesn't know he froze.
I think Ajamu's point is pretty clear, though. I mean, can there be total peace without the political prisoners, right?
Right.
And as you're asking, how, if there is an infrastructure and the political will supposedly to dialogue, well, these people are asking to dialogue. Now, why do they need to go on hunger strike to be heard? That, you know, and we expect for this to change. But I also just want to mention too that, like, I think part of the decision that we've made as a collective is to support raising funds for the legal defense of people facing charges, right? Because we know that we can't leave it up to the state to resolve this, even if it is a progressive government, right? And a lot of the folks that have been able to get out of prison was thanks to a good legal defense. But unfortunately, a lot of people cannot afford it for numerous reasons. And, that was a decision we made pretty early on, that we wanted to find lawyers that were familiar with this, if they were from the Committee in Solidarity with Political Prisoners or other folks that we've known over the years to work with, that were representing defendants pro bono. And, we want to alleviate the material impediments to having a justifiable legal defense in the court of law. And so a lot of the fundraising that we've been doing is in regards to that.
And can the fundraising be done through your website?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
You can go to Colombia-freedomcollective.org, and there's the means. All of the money goes directly to the legal defense, the pro bono legal defense of the people from Paso del Aguante, the resistance point. And you can read more about the cases of the folks that we are working with on the website. But it's a campaign that's growing. And as I mentioned, in the coming month, there are going to be several hearings that are taking off with the cases. Fortunately, several of the folks were released, albeit after way too long in prison on pretrial detention in December. But now the cases are picking up again. And we'd love to encourage folks to, join us in packing the courts virtually, because currently all the hearings are online. And that means that we can sit in on the hearings and listen to the hearings and show not just the folks that are being tried, the defendants, that they have support, that they're not alone, but also demonstrate that people around the world care about what's going on. And so if you're interested in getting in touch with us there, you can also go to our website and get in touch with us, and we can send you information about how to participate in these virtual hearings. All we ask is that you keep your microphones off and just put your name and your location, like country location, in your username, so that the folks that are in the meeting know how much support is being shown for the folks being tried.
Wow, that's really great.
Mm.
That's a really great act of solidarity. That's really wonderful. I will share with the audience that all of the articles and links that we're talking about, I have included in the program notes. So if you are watching us on YouTube and just go into the program description for this episode, all of those links are there, including articles and websites and all of that. So
Great.
So check those program notes and click and make your donation, and then be sure to join. the hearings. That is really a fantastic global act of solidarity, and easy enough to do. Yeah,
absolutely.
it's really great. So
And I think
Ajamu's back. And I wonder, Ajamu, if you talked about total peace, and that this piece and that this component with the political prisoners needs to get resolved in order, for the new Colombian government to pursue total peace and reconciliation within the country. You have been involved with several delegations, and most recently on the Caribbean coast, Buenaventura, I believe, in that general vicinity. Can you share with the audience what those delegations were created for, and what you saw, and what the results, or what the impending results are?
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Terry. And I'm hoping, I was trying to share again the report that I wrote on that mission that we were on a little bit over a month ago.
That link, your article link, is in the program notes. Hello? No. So now we lost his audio and everything. Let me see. Let's see if we can get him back, otherwise. Let me pull up, I want to pull up the article. Let me because I want you all to see this, and I'm sorry for the delay. Maybe we can get him back while I look for the article. Hold on just a second.
Looks like
Let me share that.
There he is.
Oh, okay. I was just trying to buy some time to pull up your article.
This is what happens when you do a program with Anthony Dest.
Live from Cali, Colombia.
I don't know what's going on. So I went from my computer to my phone. Now I'm back on my computer. So let's hopefully they'll give us at least 5 more minutes or so. But I was sharing that if you have that link to the report that I wrote, that we published in Black Agenda Report, I think that was February 18th or so. That'd be great to share with the audience.
Okay. It is in the program notes, but I'll put it in the chat as well. I think we lost him again. Yeah.
Looks like it.
Are you there?
I'm here.
And here's but we lost Ajamu again.
That's right.
Fantastic. Actually, I have it too, as I will. I can hear you.
Maybe you should shut your, we just lost you completely. Why don't you shut your video off and just do audio? I think the audience would be okay with that. And that might,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because we really want to hear about this delegation.
The delegation actually went to the Pacific Coast and visited a number of territories. The part that we went to is considered to be the rural parts of Buenaventura, the Buenaventura district. Buenaventura
No, we're losing you. We lost you again. Yeah, well, so one thing we know, maybe Wi-Fi infrastructure is not so good. Yeah. Or maybe not this time of day.
What's going on?
So yeah, so I want to put this in the chat, and then maybe we should, what we were hoping to talk with Ajamu about was to kind of thread the needle between, with what is happening with the political prisoners, this call for total peace, and how that is unfolding. And there have been several human rights delegations and observers who have gone into some of the, particularly in Valle Cauca, and witnessed and taken testimony from what these communities need. And a lot of the prisoners, a lot of these political prisoners, a lot of these young people come from these exact communities. So we had hoped to talk about that delegation, but Ajamu, are you here? Yeah, okay, so quickly while we have you. Hello? No, he can't stay connected. So is there anything else, Anthony, that we should
No, I just would like
focus
to
on?
encourage folks to check out the website. That's Colombia-Freedom-Collective.org. We're trying to put regular updates about issues facing political prisoners on the website as regularly as possible. There's also space for you to make a tax-deductible donation if you're in the United States, and we would greatly appreciate that. And we can ensure you that that's going to go directly into the legal defense of folks that are facing pretty steep charges. So thank you so much, Terry, for inviting us. It's too bad we didn't get to hear from Ajamu about that delegation. I know it was a very intense, but hopefully fruitful experience. So,
Well, it's a call for total peace, and in that total peace is peace for the entire region and creating a peace zone. And so we'll have a follow-up conversation. But also, Anthony, for you and your work, just to remind the audience that all of you joining this episode can listen to the court proceedings for online. And so again, it's just such a wonderful act of solidarity, and that again is on the website. And again, all of these links are in the program notes. so you can easily reference all of them. So thank you so much, Anthony. Really wonderful to meet you, and a really important conversation. I'm so glad you had time to join us.
Thank you.
And I just want to remind the audience that you've been watching What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean. We broadcast every Thursday, 7:30 p.m. Eastern on YouTube Live, YouTube channels for The Convo Couch, Code Pink, and popularresistance.org, and post-broadcast recordings can be found at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Anthony, and we'll see all of you next week.
See you.